This podcast is sponsored by Lightstep. Lightstep delivers confidence at scale for those who develop, operate, and rely upon today's powerful software applications. Answer questions and diagnose 100% of anomalies, spanning mobile, monoliths, and microservices across every service in real time. Visit lightstep.com.
Hello and welcome to the InfoQ podcast. My name is Wes Rice and I'm your host. In addition to hosting the InfoQ podcast, I chair a set of software conferences called QCon. These podcasts are glimpses into some of the people who speak at QCon and other influencers in the software industry. The next conference is in San Francisco, November 5th through 7th. On today's podcast, we're speaking with one of our speakers. He's doing both a talk and a 2-day workshop that we'll talk about near the end of the podcast. He's Vaughn Vernon, and he's a software developer with over 30 years of experience. He's well known as a leading expert in domain-driven design and a champion for reactive systems. Vaughn is also the author of Implementing Domain-Driven Design. He's the author of Reactive Messaging Patterns with the Active Model, and one that I just recently read, Domain-Driven Design Distilled. On today's podcast, we're discussing a new platform he's put together called Vlingo. The platform is open source, and it's used to simplify the building of distributed, concurrent, reactive, event-driven microservices. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Vaughn, welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Thank you very much, Wesley, and appreciate you inviting me.
So, it's open source system for building distributed, concurrent, reactive, event-driven microservice architectures. That kind of triggers all the buzzwords, doesn't it?
Well, almost. I didn't say containers and I didn't say meshes, so, it's not all of them. But that's where we are these days, and that's where computing has gone. We're very distributed. Every organization that I interact with or engage with is trying to get to microservices. Many have a very big problem with all mud monoliths, and they're just itching to get out of that.
Yeah, definitely. Tell me about Vlingo. I get the description. I know what all those are, but what is it?
You know that my interest in domain-driven design is very high. I teach workshops on DDD. I've written books on DDD. And so you would think that I'm going to be doing a lot with DDD, and that's the case. I feel that there is a need for DDD support in sort of the framework or toolkit area. And I'll have to admit that in the DDD community, some within sort of the DDD leadership or those known popular in that community have kind of been pretty negative about frameworks. They say, well, you can write your own support code in a day or two. But fact of the matter is, I just haven't found that to be the case. Teams struggle to even understand what they need to implement, let alone actually do that. And so I just want to give teams a very strong, jump start into DDD with a DDD-friendly toolkit. And the toolkit is designed around concurrency, around multi-core, and it addresses a lot of different areas. I think right now we have something like 12 different repositories out on GitHub, and maybe even more. I don't remember for sure, but we're bundling specific areas of what you would typically want to use in a reactive platform into small tools, and you can just add on, here and there what you need.
So tell me, how does the framework help you from a domain-driven design context? Like, for example, like bounded context. That's a way of thinking about how you write your software where you set the boundaries. How does the framework help lead you down the right bounded context?
I think from that standpoint, a lot will be learned from the examples that we provide. So I will provide good sample code for what does a typical kind of bounded context boundary look like, where would I draw that boundary, and then what kinds of reactive components would I want to use inside that, whether it's for supporting REST or whether it's for supporting streaming or, event-driven and so forth. So those CQRS, right, event sourcing. So any of those topics, would be inside the bounded context, but there are definitely a few components that will support outside. And of course, with Vlingo cluster, you can cluster a bounded context or the actors or the entities, let's say, within a bounded context. And you can send messages across the cluster, stuff like that. And the thing is, the framework does not get in your way. And I purposely stay away from a lot of technical thinking. It may be a little bit difficult to describe without seeing the code, but just for example, the REST interface or the Vlingo HTTP component has a very fluent feel to it, where even your expressions about an asynchronous completion of some kind of response to a request is being handled in a very expressive or fluent way with an API. And it reads just like the way that you would reason about the code, the way that you would have a conversation. So even on the technical side of things, you're speaking even a technical language that just fits in or is very compatible with your business language.
So what's the history? Where did Vlingo come from? How did it come about? How long has the project been out there?
I would have to go back some years. I was working on a Vlingo-like vision, and I'm going to say it's probably close to 7 years ago now. And I was speaking at a conference. I think I was speaking at Spring One at the time, and I gave a talk on DDD, but I also threw in some topics around reactive. And I didn't realize it, but there were some, reactive proponents in my talk, and they approached me pretty quickly after my talk when they found out what I was working on, and they tried to sort of urge me not to do that and to join their efforts instead. So I considered that over some months, and I decided to look into potentially doing that more, and so I kind of put my vision on hold. So my vision is not new, but I have more recently decided that for various reasons that I just think that there needs to be a reactive toolkit that is a better host to a DDD environment and provide the kinds of tools that a DDD project would typically want to use and not get in your way. And I really think that lightweight is very important. And so Vlingo is a lightweight set of tools. The whole platform right now is about less than 1 megabyte in size. And again, it does a significant amount of work. I could stop developing right now, and consumers of the platform would have plenty of support that would take them a very long way. I'm not stopping now. But in other words, with a megabyte, there's a lot of value there. And here's the thing, right? I grew up programming in the world when IBM PCs had at most 256K of RAM and dual floppies. And so I had to write code at the time that worked very well in that kind of environment. And crunching down components and lines of code and the .obj output or .o output in Unix was extremely important at that time. And so that's been, my mindset for quite a while. And it's really scary to think of how much I used to do with 256K or even a megabyte of RAM. And you can't even boot an operating system with a megabyte of RAM anymore, right? I don't even, maybe some Linux variants, but not too much.
Is there a underlying philosophy with Vlingo that's maybe different from other systems?
Well, for one, it's lightweight, but it is actor-based. I have been very in tune with the actor model approach of computing for quite a while, and I have a lot of respect for what has been accomplished with Erlang and that sort of ecosystem, and very, very resilient systems that just absolutely can't fail, right? And so I'm very interested in that. And so actors are what I think are objects done right. I think that, when I read some quotes from Alan Kay some years back about basically the actor model retained what he thought were the most important ideas behind the object or behind the object idea, the object-oriented. And when I think of that, and I think of my Smalltalk days, everything was message passing. Objects, we sent messages to objects. Actually, when you sent a message in Smalltalk, at least the Smalltalk that I used, it was all blocking. But you didn't really notice blocking or not blocking. It was just you were sending a message. And so I've had messaging and eventing and so forth on my brain for well over 20 years. And it's just the way that I think about solving problems. So to me, it's not intimidating at all because of my background, but I want to introduce people to the idea that if they even understand support for Swing UI or Windows, Win32 or Win64 API or any of that, and the message sending between windows and the message loop and so forth, you're not entirely, foreign to the ideas behind the actor model. And so it's really not a daunting concept to pick up, and you gain so many benefits from it.
Well, let's talk about the architecture just a bit. I want to ask a few more questions on like licensing model and things like that, but we're in this space to talk about architecture. So what's it look like? What's the structure? We've got actors, of course, but how do you put together the system? What's it look like?
Yeah, sort of underneath it all, there is this sort of very low level, what I call Vlingo common. And I know that's going to sound scary to everyone, like, oh no, a common library, right? Everything is coupled. Well, not really. It's just things that other components use. And it's really only, it's probably 10 different classes, maybe 15 classes that tend to get reused in different parts of the toolkit. And then on top of that, or beside that is Vlingo actors, and that is the actor model implementation. So consider that really the foundation. That Vlingo actors is the foundation. So there's the abstraction of an actor world. So that there's the world that the actors live in, and then there's also the abstraction within a world called a stage. So actors, play or act on a stage, and there can be multiple stages in a world. And what that basically means is you can divide, sort of partition your thread pooling and things like that, or protect a certain stage that is kind of like a foundational stage, like maybe clustering or the actor system itself, or Vlingo HTTP will want to run in its own stage and then have a separate stage for the service that's running on top of those things.
Okay, so if I remember right from reading, the Vlingo actors are type safe, right?
Yes, that is correct. And interestingly, if you go to any of the other kind of like popular actor systems, whether it's in Erlang or Elixir on the JVM or pretty much anywhere, type safety is not a strongly supported in those other platforms. Whereas with Vlingo, it's a baseline requirement that messages are sent in a type safe way. So you literally get a reference to an actor, but it's a virtual reference. But any method that you invoke on that virtual reference is type safe, and the message that is created behind that is sent and then invoked on the actor in a type safe way. So I think that's a huge win, and it doesn't cost any overhead. That's the beauty of it.
We were talking offline. One of the things that I find interesting is that this is a framework that you can implement concurrent microservices in an actor-based model, and it's a small code base. So it's easy to get your mind around. You can take a look at it, and you can learn a lot, if nothing else, regardless of what's going to happen with the framework or where things may go. I think it's very interesting as a learning tool to be able to kind of see the way things were put together on not just an actor system, but also maybe the way that you did consensus with a cluster system. So I find that very interesting.
Yeah, in fact, what I'll add to that is any contributors who have come to the JVM side of things where the platform is further along, they can jump in and understand one of the components like Vlingo HTTP or Vlingo actors quickly, and they can contribute significantly to it. For example, we recently had a contribution made of Vlingo telemetry. So now you can have full metrics on actor message throughput, which actors are keeping up with their messages, which ones aren't. And this was all done by a very good developer, but it only took me maybe an hour to explain all the ins and outs of where this developer needed to plug in. There's another fellow working on Vlingo HTTP, adding a Fluent API for creating resource handlers, right? Basically, I get a ping on a URL. How does that get dispatched asynchronously? And he's doing a great job. But again, the platform is so easy to understand that I can get contributors spun up pretty quickly.
I was just going to ask, so how does a stage or a world relate to, say, like a bounded context?
So you would have a Vlingo world per bounded context. And virtually speaking, that's true. Although if you're a multi-node cluster, right, you will have a world on every single one of the VMs. But virtually speaking, it's really just one world. Although think of having a different stage for basically the distribution through a cluster of, this stage is a certain entry on a hash ring.
So then I guess it's correct to say each world has its own ubiquitous language, right?
Yeah, that's probably accurate. Yeah. So, yeah. And then on top of actors, you have a Vlingo cluster. And of course, that's a way to, spread nodes over a number of VMs, whether it's on virtual machines or physical machines or whatever. And then on top of that is a directory, a Vlingo directory, which is service registration and discovery. And that runs in its own cluster. So that's actually an independently deployed cluster, if you will. And that's where services in your whole system, like microservices or a bounded context, would register itself, and it would say, okay, these are my endpoints. And whoever's interested in that will know what those things mean to them. So they will simply then be informed over a key multicast, here's this, you may want to use this or whatever. And they can choose to listen to and collaborate with whatever services they need to. And then there's Vlingo HTTP, which is a very REST-centric web server, I guess you would call it, although right now the idea is not to really support, templating and HTML and things like that, although you're not prevented from doing that, but it's really just a REST engine that's very, very fast and very compact. And then there's Vlingo Auth, which is an authentication and authorization tool, and you're not expected to use that. You don't have to use it in your services, although it's available. But what that does is it actually gives the various Vlingo components that protect data, like streaming data or database data or things like that. It gives them a way to protect, who can actually see this information and what parts of it they could see and so forth.
Is all this implemented on the JVM?
Yes. But also there is a team working on Vlingo Net, which is a .NET edition of it. And that's something that I didn't necessarily intend to get into on my own, but there were some folks who really wanted to implement that. So after a bit of, it's going to take extra cycles for me to support that. I don't think I've done any coding on that platform, although I could. But the folks that are working on it are very, very strong .NET, C#, idiomatically proficient programmers, so I'm happy to let them run with that.
So what's the community look like right now around Vlingo?
I'm starting to get volunteers, so I probably have 4 additional folks helping on the Java side. That may not sound very significant, but I've actually not done a lot of work to try to attract contributors right now because just sort of getting bootstrapped and getting my ideas out there in a way that people can then run with them and add on and contribute has taken me about 6 months to get there. So I see that growing, and there are actually, I think, more folks on the .NET side. I'll tell you, the Microsoft world just continues to amaze me how they've kind of reinvented themselves from a very proprietary world into the people who are so interested in open source that they just want to, sort of latch on and contribute to anything they can get their hands on. So that's interesting to me.
It's not your father's .NET anymore, father's Microsoft anymore. Yeah. So let's talk about some of the customers that have adopted Vlingo. What kind of stories you're hearing? Who's on it? Do you have early adopters?
Yeah, so I have a few early adopters. I'm not going to mention names of companies. It wouldn't really be fair because I would say that the platform is not totally prime time right now. And so it would be unfair to even claim that I'm at that point. But I would say we will be at prime time level, certainly before QCon in San Francisco. But one of the reports that I'm getting and aligns with my experiences that, for example, Vlingo HTTP is just a screamer. Right now, we're talking about a REST-based server that's probably not more than 4 months old, right? And it's competing with Tomcat and, the async Tomcat and Spring Boot. And there's another something HTTP component that I don't want to talk too much about, but as I understand it, for someone who uses that platform, Vlingo HTTP is just blowing its doors off. So I'm pretty happy. And the thing is, I'm really not even focused on total throughput right now. I'm using JMeter just to pound the endpoints to find out where are the bugs, right? I just want to try to drive bugs out. But other people are looking at it from the standpoint of what kind of throughput can we get? And I am seeing 3,000 requests and responses per second is actually kind of a low estimate on a single node.
Wow. So what about the platform itself? You mentioned .NET or a .NET version. Are your libraries mostly just Java and then C#? Are you supporting a polyglot Notion? What is that story?
Well, some of the tools could be polyglot, right? Because I can provide a TCP interface to some of the components that we'll be rolling out later. It just really depends on what component you're interested in. But my target is specifically for the JVM. I think from my vantage point, I see the JVM as at least the second most popular language and platform in the world right now. JVM and JVM languages are very popular. Depending on, again, the surveys that you read or the snapshots of language popularity. For example, Kotlin has really risen in popularity in the last few years, and even, I think you could say, meteoric rise in the past 6 months or 9 months. And who's going to argue with that, right? And again, depending on where you listen or read, Kotlin has already taken over Scala, or, I don't know that I exactly believe that, but I don't know where these numbers come from, but that's interesting.
Is this Java 10? What version of Java JVM you run on?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started this, I kind of limited myself actually to Java 1.6, and I know that sounds a little bit nutty, but I know that there are a lot of companies out there still running on old JVMs, and I wanted to sort of be able to support that environment and just sort of slide into that. But with the kind of new cycles that Oracle is turning out JDKs, right? 1.8 is already basically obsolete.
They just released the release candidate for Java 11.
Right. So in moving up to Java 8, I'm just really maybe behind the curve on the Java version. But okay, I have all the facilities that I need with Java 8. And if I code to the lowest common denominator, I know it's going to work up the chain. So I'm okay with that right now.
So it's open source. Is everything pushed upstream? Is there only one?
So if you go to github.com/Vlingo, Vlingo, it's all there. I don't have any sort of enterprise edition or whatever. And I don't know that I will ever have an enterprise edition, but if I do, it's not going to be that soon.
What about support, things like that? I think the project is about 6 months old. Is that right?
Yeah, something like that.
So how do you envision maybe support? Is it just pure open source, community-based?
Yeah, pure open source. Again, I have contributors that are just completely volunteering. And as am I, I'm not getting paid for doing this work. And so I really appreciate it. And the contributors that I have are really strong. I mean, it's just amazing how good these guys are, and the things that they're turning out is just wonderful. So I'm very proud of them, with those abilities and the fact that I have folks like that interested in contributing. And in terms of support long term, I want to make this platform affordable. And when I say affordable, I mean, I don't want there to be a hesitation when a company says, should we use this, and how much would a support license be per year? And when they add it up, and it's like, well, it's going to cost, and we're a startup, right? And it's going to cost us $250,000 a year or more to license this. Yikes, we may have to rethink things. Can we use this and run without support? I don't want that at all. And I also think that there's a significant support philosophy or licensing philosophy that says, let's say that a typical entry point to your platform is $100,000. Let's just say, pick a number, right? And in order to sell that support, you have to put a couple people on an airplane and they fly across the nation, or they fly around the world and they go make a sales pitch, and then they follow up with taking care of all people's questions and needs. And there's pre-sales architecture. There's all this stuff. And let's say you finally, the client says, okay, we're going to spend $100,000 for your platform for 1 year. And they do that. And you calculate the numbers on it and you go like, well, that's cool. We just cleared $40,000, because you spent $60,000 trying to make the sale. I don't want to be in that business. And plus, I think that it's unnecessary. I don't think that it's really necessary. And it could be that a very few people could actually support the platform long term. So that's more what I'm interested in. And my company is purely bootstrapped, right? I mean, or I should say the platform is bootstrapped. Anything that I do right now is being paid for out of my pocket.
There's a lot of movement these days that I hear from companies about cross-cutting concerns out of libraries and putting them into, say, like a service mesh, putting into like container sidecars, things like that. So this is one of the few platforms I've heard today kind of come forward adding a library. Was there a rationale or reasoning?
Yeah.
Why library and not maybe a sidecar model or another model that kind of follows along with containers and Kubernetes or an orchestrator?
Well, it's very heavyweight for one thing. I have to say, I know that service meshes are solving a set of problems, and there's a pretty popular tweet out there that, when you start using distributed computing, you go from understanding where a bug is to trying to solve a murder mystery, right? And certainly that's been true. And I think that service mesh with, this sort of like all-encompassing, consular view of what's going on in your distributed system is very important and help you to understand that. But you also have to understand that with a service mesh and a sidecar model, you are literally doubling the number of nodes in your solution, in your whole system that is using that mesh. And so you might say, well, it's telling me everything that's going on. Yeah, but how many other things could go wrong with that kind of situation? I don't know. I am definitely not an expert. I mean, this stuff is so new anyway. There are very few experts at it. But I think another situation is like, just imagine if you're constantly sending messages between actors and those are going through a sidecar to get somewhere. Whereas, I can send a lot of messages. I mean, anywhere from maybe 3 million messages per second between actors to even up to around 70 million per second. That's just not going to happen over a TCP connection. So I think that's an important distinction. And you can still take your bounded context or the nodes within your bounded context and deploy them in a container, in a service mesh. So now, okay, you have various nodes in a cluster. Each of those nodes could be deployed with a sidecar. And there's nothing preventing you doing that. The library is very lightweight, right? So even imagine that you build your deployment and the jar file that you're building ends up being like a couple megabytes in size instead of, like 40 or 50 megabytes. And you're wondering what all could go wrong in there. So, I mean, from that vantage point, Vlingo is going to be a very small portion of the overhead and that kind of deployment.
Right. So it still could be inside a container.
Absolutely.
I know that folks that use sidecar model would say that definitely adds a little bit of overhead, adds a little performance hit, but the amount of flexibility and insight it gives into operating microservices is well worth the trade-off. And then I think there's folks that are in the Cilium community that are doing some stuff that are just having incredible performance. And it's kind of layer 4 stuff that's doing some really impressive stuff. So maybe something like that with a tool set like Vlingo could be an interesting case.
Yeah, I mean, I could even see potentially a partnership with a company like that where they want to make Vlingo part of their, sort of standard distribution or something. I'm all for that. I have no reason to think that would be problematic. It would be great. And if people are solving the overhead problems, or if they're running on Google's network, that's going to be a very small problem for you.
So you talked about clustering. How do you achieve clustering? What's the consensus protocol?
Interestingly, I don't like this word, but I like the algorithm. It's called the bully algorithm. Okay, and the bully algorithm, I think, is pretty much like RAF, but the idea is that you simply have a leader election situation, and it's based on a simple comparison of what is the greatest, literally like a compare to strings, right, or numeric compare of node IDs. And what each node does is when it knows that a leader needs to be elected, it simply says, this is my ID, but I'm going to distribute to every one that I am aware of, every node that I'm aware of that has a greater ID than me. And I'm going to defer to them and say, you can take leadership, because I know that leadership doesn't belong to me. And then that sort of election takes place very quickly. And in that case, right, basically the leader or the node that says, I am not aware of any other node that has a higher node number than me, but I will still broadcast the fact that a leader needs to be elected. If none of those nodes hears back something within a period of time, it says, okay, I must be the highest leader, and it takes the leadership, and then it informs the other nodes that it's the leader. So it's pretty simple, actually.
What happens with a partition? Do you get 2 leaders?
Right now, the cluster has to have a quorum. So if you have an odd number, right, if you're always running with an odd number and you have enough nodes for a quorum, there's actually no way that, let's just take an example, right? If you have 5 nodes and there's a partition between even 2 of those nodes and the 3 are talking together, then there's no way for the 2 to say, well, one of us is the leader, because it doesn't even have a quorum. Now, what's an interesting partition is when one node can see 2 other nodes and another node can see 2 other nodes, but they can't see all 4 of each other, right? And in that case, the bully algorithm works out really well, because the ultimate leader who says, I'm in the lead because I have the highest identity, the greatest identity comparison, broadcast to the followers, and it says, okay, you're a follower. Well, any of those followers can see the other nodes' claim to leadership come in, and it simply says, no, I refuse to take your leadership because I already know of a greater leader. Even if you can't see it, I'm telling you, you can't have it, right? And so that leader can either heal later and finally see the ultimate leader, or it could keep sending out these broadcasts every, X number of milliseconds or seconds and saying, okay, I should have leadership. And then the other follower nodes just say, no, you can't have it. There's another leader. And so in essence, it knows that it's partitioned, then it'll eventually hopefully see that leader come back, or, get a visual of that leader.
How do these all communicate? What type of messages are they passing? What's the protocol?
Very lightweight TCP, but it could be UDP. I've just gone with TCP as the initial. And again, all of this is pretty much like going with the simplest thing that could possibly work, sort of an MVP mindset. And therefore, we can always tune and make things faster later. But right now, it's just the idea of just keeping things as simple as we possibly can.
Thanks for chatting. Before we wrap up, I want to talk just a bit about the 2-day workshop that you're doing at QCon San Francisco. So that's domain-driven design, right? Well, tell me about the workshop you're planning.
So this is called event-oriented domain-driven design. So it's a very event-centric kind of workshop where events are not only a first-class citizen, but kind of taking the front row of attention in the workshop. We do go through DDD from a very sort of fast-paced introduction to DDD, but basically the things that you need to know. For example, I teach you some context mapping of DDD, but I don't teach you everything about context mapping, because I think that we're just going to focus on using like these 2 or 3 context map approaches to integration between the different bounded contexts. And, I introduce you to the tactical patterns of DDD, and it is a very reactive workshop, but it doesn't necessarily have to use actors, although if someone wants to use the Vlingo platform as, sort of their baseline, they can do that. But I have a very simple, what I call a Microservices toolkit that runs on the JVM.NET, and also I have a PHP version. So any of those sort of worlds can feel free to join the workshop and have a microservices platform that's mocked out, right? Everything is in memory, everything is multi-threaded, and everything is running in a single VM, even though it looks like it's distributed.
Now, it's not a Vlingo workshop.
No, it's not a Vlingo workshop, but I feel very confident that if someone would want to use Vlingo, in that I will have the samples, the same, sort of infrastructure for the workshop exercises running on Vlingo by that point.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you again for taking the time to chat with us on the InfoQ podcast.
Thank you very much. Okay, take care.